Why did you do that?
Well, I only had one deep freezer.
And you feel no remorse for that?
I would kill him again.
Detroit, Michigan, March 24th, 2015. Court officers arrive at a small, run-down apartment on the east side of the city. Their task is routine: serve an eviction notice on a tenant who had fallen behind on rent. But what they're about to uncover inside is anything but routine. Behind the faded curtains and cluttered furniture, inside a battered white freezer, waits one of the most disturbing secrets in American true crime. When the officers pry the freezer door open, they freeze in shock. Inside are the frozen, contorted bodies of 2 children, wrapped in plastic, stacked like discarded leftovers, their faces locked in expressions of terror that had been preserved for years. This was the world of Michelle Blair. She was 35 years old, a mother of 4, living in that same apartment with 2 surviving children. To her neighbors, she seemed strict but ordinary. She kept to herself, sometimes yelling at her kids in public, but nothing that screamed monster. No one realized that 2 of her children, 9-year-old Stephen and 13-year-old Stoney, had not been seen in public in years. Not at school, not at doctor's appointments. They had simply vanished, and nobody noticed. When detectives brought Blair in for questioning, there was no drawn-out denial, no elaborate cover-up. She confessed almost immediately, but what she described was even more horrifying than the discovery itself.
I'm already saying that I did it. I'm freely giving myself and accepting life in prison.
According to Blair, both Stephen and Stoney had sexually abused her youngest child. Whether or not this was true has never been fully proven. But instead of seeking help, Blair appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. And her version of justice was sadistic beyond imagination. She admitted that Stephen's final months in 2012 were filled with relentless torture. She beat him with extension cords until his skin split. She poured scalding hot water on him. She tied plastic bags over his head until he passed out, then ripped them off so he could breathe, only to do it again. She forced him to drink household cleaners like Windex, and then, when she decided she was done, she strangled him with her bare hands. She stuffed his small body into the freezer. For Blair, the freezer wasn't just storage. It was her coffin of choice. 9 months later, in May 2013, Blair turned her rage on her daughter, Stoney. She claimed Stoney, too, had harmed the youngest child. The torture followed the same script: beatings, starvation, suffocation. And when the girl's body finally went limp, Blair smothered her with a plastic bag. Stoney joined her brother in the freezer, stacked above him like trash. For the next 2 years, Michelle Blair lived in that apartment with her 2 surviving daughters. Imagine it: 2 little girls eating breakfast, watching TV, doing homework, while their siblings' frozen corpses sat just feet away. Blair told her daughters never to open the freezer. For them, the appliance became a ghostly presence, something forbidden, something deadly. The discovery of the bodies made headlines around the world. Blair was branded the freezer mum. The case wasn't just about murder. It was about prolonged, sadistic torture, a crime that played out over years while systems designed to protect children looked the other way. In court, Blair became infamous for her outbursts. She showed no remorse. She screamed at prosecutors, cursed the fathers of her children, and spat at reporters. She declared she would kill again if she ever discovered more abuse. One of her chilling courtroom quotes went viral: "I don't feel no remorse for the death of them demons." The fathers of the dead children sat in shock. One broke down in tears as Blair pointed at him and shouted that he was worthless. Victim impact statements turned into scenes of chaos. Even the judge admitted he had never witnessed such raw hatred in his courtroom. But the true tragedy lies with the surviving daughters. They had grown up watching their siblings vanish. They were silenced with threats. They were forced to live with the smell of decay, the sound of their mother's rage. and the knowledge that disobedience could mean they'd be next. The trial was brief. There was no doubt about her guilt. Blair had confessed. The bodies were in her freezer, and her surviving daughters testified about the abuse they endured. In June 2015, Michelle Blair was sentenced to life in prison without parole for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of torture. The judge called her crimes the ultimate betrayal of motherhood. Even after sentencing, Blair has never expressed regret. In interviews, she repeats the same defense, that she was protecting her youngest child. But the sheer cruelty of her methods, the burning, the suffocating, the years of hiding the bodies, reveal something much darker. Today, Michelle Blair sits in the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. She is in her mid-40s. She spends her days in isolation, despised by fellow inmates, remembered only as the freeze mom. What makes this case so haunting is not just the brutality, but the secrecy. Stephen and Stoney's absence slipped through the cracks of schools, social services, and neighbors. No one demanded answers. No one knocked on the door. For years, their mother's freezer became their tomb, and nobody knew. Michelle Blair's story is a chilling reminder that evil can live in plain sight, behind closed doors, behind the smile of a mother walking her child to school. Evil that doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the person you're supposed to trust the most. The 1960s and 70s in rural New York were a time when infant deaths were often written off as crib death, what doctors now call sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. Families grieved, communities mourned, and science had few answers. But in the case of Juanita Hoyt, SIDS wasn't a medical mystery. It was a mask, one that hid the cold hands of a mother who murdered 5 of her own babies. Juanita was born in 1946, a quiet girl from a poor family in upstate New York. She married young, at just 20 years old, to a man named Tim Hoyt. By the time she was 21, she had given birth to her first child, Eric. From the outside, she appeared to be living the American dream, a young wife, a new baby, and a future to build. But behind the closed doors of the Hoyt household, things were far darker. Eric was only 3 months old when he suddenly died in January 1965. Doctors labeled it crib death, a tragedy, but not unusual at the time. Juanita and Tim buried their son, devastated. Just a few months later, their daughter Julie was born. But by September, before she was even 3 months old, she too was dead. Again, crib death. The town grieved with them. 2 babies gone in less than a year. People brought casseroles, hugs, and sympathy. No one suspected anything sinister. Juanita's 3rd child, James, was born in 1966, but like the others, he didn't live long. He died at just 3 months old. The official cause, once again, crib death. By now, whispers had begun in the community. How could one family lose 3 babies in such a short time? But medical science in the 1960s didn't have the tools to challenge the explanation. Doctors told the Hoyts they were simply unlucky. Juanita, meanwhile, played the grieving mother, accepting sympathy while hiding a monstrous secret. Her 4th child, Molly, was born in 1968. Same pattern. 3 months later, she was dead. Then came Noah in 1970. He too was gone within 3 months. 5 children, 5 sudden deaths, all ruled natural. For decades, Juanita Hoyt walked free, her crimes buried with her children. She even became a foster mother and adopted a 6th child, who survived. To neighbors, she was a woman of tragedy, a mother cursed by fate. In reality, she was a serial killer, hiding behind a medical mystery. The truth only began to emerge in the early 1990s. New studies on SIDS showed that the odds of one family losing multiple children to the syndrome were astronomically low. 5 deaths in one family? Almost impossible. a local district attorney reopened the Hoyt cases. Investigators began to suspect that something darker had been at play. In 1994, police brought Juanita in for questioning. She was now in her late 40s, living an ordinary life in a quiet neighborhood. At first, she denied everything, but after hours of pressure, she broke. Her confession stunned detectives. She admitted she had slaughtered each of her babies with household items, blankets, pillows, whatever was at hand. She described the murders almost casually, saying she was overwhelmed by their crying and needed it to stop. 5 helpless infants, 5 murders, each carried out by their own mother. At trial, the defense argued that Juanita was mentally impaired, with the mind of a teenager, easily manipulated into confessing. But the weight of her words, combined with the sheer improbability of 5 Sid's deaths, was impossible to ignore. In 1995, Juanita Hoyt was convicted of 5 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. She never made it that far. In 1998, just 4 years into her sentence, Juanita died of cancer at the age of 52. She went to her grave without ever fully explaining why she did it. The Hoyt case left a deep scar on both the medical and legal communities. For decades, her children's deaths had been written off as natural, allowing a killer to continue unchecked. Doctors were forced to rethink how SIDS is diagnosed, and prosecutors across the country began re-examining suspicious infant deaths that had been quickly labeled as crybdeath. The story also raised a haunting question. Was Juanita Hoyt simply a mother who snapped under the pressure of caring for multiple babies? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who exploited medical ignorance to get away with murder? What makes her story so terrifying isn't just the body count. It's the betrayal of trust. Babies cry. That's their language, their lifeline. For most mothers, the sound is an instinctual call to comfort and protect. For Juanita, it became a trigger for violence. Instead of cradling her children, she silenced them forever. 5 tiny graves, 5 lives snuffed out before they had a chance to begin. And all by the hands of the woman who was supposed to love them most. Today, Juanita Hoyt's name lives in infamy. Her case is taught in both medical schools and criminal justice classes as a chilling example of how easily evil can be mistaken for tragedy and how long it can take for the truth to come out. In the small town of Raymond, Washington, the Nottock family lived in a modest farmhouse surrounded by forest. To outsiders, they looked ordinary. Shelley Nottock, her husband Dave, and the children who came in and out of their lives. But behind those doors, behind the smiling pictures and friendly waves to neighbors, lurked one of the most sadistic mothers America has ever seen. Michelle Shelley Nottock was born in 1954. From a young age, she learned how to manipulate. She told elaborate lies, spun dramatic stories about illnesses or abuse, and demanded sympathy. As she grew older, she mastered the art of control, not with guns or knives, but with humiliation, guilt, and psychological terror. When she became a mother, she didn't nurture, she destroyed. Shelley's 3 daughters, Nikki, Sammy, and Tori, grew up in a household of constant abuse. Shelley forced them to strip naked and endure beatings. She humiliated them by making them wear oversized diapers as punishment. She starved them, sometimes forcing them to eat their own vomit. She manipulated them with cycles of cruelty and affection, breaking their spirits while convincing them she was their only source of love. But it didn't stop with her daughters. Shelley had a habit of taking in vulnerable people, troubled friends, relatives, or boarders who needed a place to stay. She presented herself as generous, the kind woman who would open her home to those in need. In reality, these people became new victims in her house of horrors. One of them was Kathy Loreno, a hairdresser and family friend. Kathy moved in with the Nottocks in the early 1990s. At first, it seemed like she had found a safe place to land, but Shelley quickly turned on her. She starved Kathy, forced her to do endless chores, humiliated her constantly, and beat her until she was weak and frail. In 1994, Kathy died after years of abuse. Shelley and her husband, Dave, didn't call the police. Instead, Dave, a Vietnam veteran, admitted later that he burned Kathy's body in the backyard furnace at Shelley's command. For years, Kathy's family searched for her, never knowing she'd been tortured to death just miles away. But Kathy wasn't the only victim. A nephew, Shane Watson, also came to live with the Notex. Shane was just a teenager, and at first he bonded with Shelley's daughters. He saw the abuse, recognized it for what it was, and even began documenting it with a secret camera. When Shelley discovered what he was doing, she ordered her husband Dave to kill him. In 1995, Shane was shot in the head. Once again, his body was burned, and his disappearance explained away with lies. For years, Shelley kept her grip on everyone in that house. The daughters, terrified of her wrath, remained silent. Dave, loyal and broken, obeyed her commands. Neighbors suspected something strange. The constant movement of people in and out of the house, the stories Shelley told about missing friends or relatives, but nobody could prove anything. By the early 2000s, another victim entered her web. An elderly man named Ron Woodworth moved in after falling on hard times. Just like the others, he was starved, beaten, forced to do endless work, and stripped of his dignity. By 2003, Ron was dead too. His body was disposed of like the others. The turning point came when Shelley's youngest daughter, Tori, broke the silence. Terrified of her mother but desperate to escape, she reached out to relatives and revealed the truth about the House of Horrors. Police investigated, and the walls of Shelley's empire finally collapsed. In 2003, Shelley and Dave Notek were arrested. The truth spilled out. Years of abuse, manipulation, torture, and multiple deaths. The daughters testified about the nightmare they had endured. Dave confessed to helping dispose of bodies, but placed the blame squarely on Shelley as the mastermind. The trial shocked Washington. Prosecutors called Shelley a sadist who thrived on control and cruelty. Her daughters described years of humiliation that went beyond physical abuse into pure psychological warfare. Neighbors admitted they had long suspected something, but never imagined the scale of horror happening inside that farmhouse. In 2004, Shelley Notek pled guilty to second-degree murder and manslaughter, as well as assault charges. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Dave received 15 years. For many, the sentence felt far too short. Shelley wasn't just abusive, she was lethal. At least 3 people were dead because of her, and countless others had been scarred for life. The daughters, though survivors, described years of therapy and nightmares that continued long after their mother was locked away. In 2022, Shelley Notek was released from prison, walking free after serving her sentence. The news horrified her surviving victims, who feared she might once again find vulnerable people to control and destroy. Her story was immortalized in the best-selling book, If You Tell, by Greg Olson, which gave voice to her daughter's experience and exposed the depths of her sadism to the world. Through their testimony, Shelley became infamous, not just as a bad mother, but as one of the most evil maternal figures in modern true crime. What makes her story so chilling is the mix of manipulation and brutality. She didn't act in sudden fits of rage. She calculated. She slowly destroyed the people around her, feeding off their pain, convincing them they had nowhere else to go. She turned her own daughters into silent witnesses to murder, forcing them to live in fear that they would be next. To this day, the name Shelley Notek stands as a reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of strangers or serial killers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it wears the face of a mother, smiling to neighbors, opening her home, while inside, it's nothing but terror. Some killer mothers lash out in sudden bursts of rage. Others slowly unravel under the weight of stress and trauma. But then there are the cold calculators, the women who plan, who plot, who manipulate. Brenda Andrew wasn't just a killer. She was a con artist, a seductress, and the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. Brenda was born in 1963, raised in a conservative religious family in Oklahoma. To outsiders, she seemed to fit the mold of a classic suburban mom. She married her high school sweetheart, Rob Andrew, and together they had 2 children. The family attended church, volunteered in the community, and presented themselves as a wholesome, middle-class household. But behind the image, Brenda was restless. She craved attention, money, and excitement. By the late 1990s, her marriage to Rob was falling apart. Rob was steady, responsible, an advertising executive who provided for the family. Brenda, on the other hand, wanted more, and she found it in the form of an affair with a man named James Pavat, a former insurance salesman and fellow churchgoer. Together, they began a romance built not only on lust, but on greed. Rob had a life insurance policy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Brenda, along with her new lover, wanted it. In November 2001, the track was set. Brenda invited Rob over to her Oklahoma City home. He thought it would be a routine handoff. Instead, he walked into an ambush. As Rob entered the garage, he was shot twice with a shotgun. The first blast tore through his arm. The second hit his torso. He collapsed on the concrete floor, gasping for breath. Brenda stood nearby, watching as her lover finished the job. Rob bled out within minutes, murdered in cold blood, in the very place where he once parked the family car. What makes this case especially chilling is the presence of the children. Brenda's son and daughter were inside the house during the murder, forced to listen as their father's life was stolen. Afterward, Brenda calmly told them their father was dead. Police quickly focused on Brenda. Her story didn't add up. She claimed masked intruders had broken in and attacked Rob, but investigators uncovered the affair, the financial motive, and the insurance papers that linked Brenda and James Pavat to the murder. The duo had meticulously planned the killing, down to disabling security systems and preparing getaway routes. When the net closed in, Brenda didn't face justice immediately. Instead, she fled the country with her children, trying to vanish into Mexico. For months, she evaded capture, living on the run, dragging her kids from place to place while law enforcement hunted her. Eventually, she was caught in Mexico in 2002 and extradited back to the United States. Her trial became a media sensation in Oklahoma. Prosecutors painted Brenda as the ultimate femme fatale, a woman who used her sexuality and charm to manipulate men, then turned to murder for money. They revealed that Brenda had staged sexual encounters to distract potential witnesses, and even tried to seduce members of her church for help. She wasn't just a killer, she was a predator who used every tool at her disposal to get what she wanted. The most damning evidence came from her children. They testified about the night of the murder, how their father walked into the garage and never came back out. The voices broke in court as they recounted hearing the gunshots that ended Rob's life. The betrayal was total, not just a wife betraying her husband, but a mother betraying her children by forcing them to live through their father's execution. In 2004, Brenda Andrew was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury sentenced her to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row, a title she still holds today. James Pavat, her lover and accomplice, also received the death penalty. What stands out about Brenda's case is the sheer selfishness. This wasn't a crime of passion or a mother suffering from delusion. This was about money and control. Brenda wanted Rob gone because he was in the way of her affair and her financial ambitions. She valued an insurance payout over her children's well-being, forcing them to grow up without a father and with the knowledge that their own mother had orchestrated his murder. To this day, Brenda maintains her innocence, claiming she was framed and that masked intruders were responsible. But the evidence tells a different story. Financial documents, witness testimony, the trail of planning that tied her directly to the killing. Brenda Andrews' name doesn't always make national headlines like Casey Anthony or Susan Smith. But in Oklahoma, she is infamous. A suburban mother who traded the image of perfection for the reality of death row. She sits in her cell at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, appealing her sentence. But the shadow of her crime never fades. Because in the end, Brenda wasn't just a mother who killed. She was a mother who conspired, who plotted, who calculated every move like a game of chess. She weaponized her role as a wife and mother to disarm those around her, then struck with lethal precision. Rob Andrew never stood a chance. And her children, they were left with scars deeper than anyone can measure, forced to testify against their own mother, knowing that the person who gave them life was also responsible for destroying it. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, bakes cookies, and sits in the front pew at church. That's why the story of Michelle Cahoe sent shockwaves through Iowa. She wasn't the stereotype of a monster. She was a mother, a neighbor, a familiar face in the community. And yet, beneath that quiet suburban image, she was plotting one of the most brutal betrayals imaginable, the murder of her own children. Michelle Kehoe lived in Coralville, Iowa, with her husband Gene and their two sons, Sean, age 7, and Seth, just 2 years old. To outsiders, the Kehoes seemed like a normal family. They went to church, attended community events, and lived in a quiet neighborhood. But behind closed doors, Michelle was unraveling. Her marriage was strained, her finances were collapsing, and she battled depression. To friends, she seemed exhausted, but no one believed she was dangerous. That illusion shattered on November 9th, 2008. On that Sunday, Michelle told her husband she was taking the boys for a short trip. She packed them into the family van and drove into the countryside. Her destination, a remote area near the small town of Littleton, surrounded by gravel roads, trees, and farmland. It was the kind of place where nobody would hear screams. When they arrived, Michelle began her plan. She told her boys they were going to play a game. She taped their eyes shut with duct tape and bound their hands. To little Sean, it was confusing. To Seth, it must have been terrifying. But they trusted their mum. They didn't know that she was holding a knife. The attack was merciless. Michelle slit Seth's throat, nearly decapitating him. The toddler's body went limp, almost instantly. Then she turned on Sean, stabbing him again and again. In the head, in the neck, in the chest. He fought for his life, struggling against the tape, gasping for breath as blood poured down his shirt. But Sean refused to die. He ripped the tape from his eyes and broke free, stumbling into the road. Michelle chased him, knife still in her hand, stabbing him as he ran. Finally, Sean collapsed on the side of the gravel road, bleeding out. And that's when fate intervened. A passing motorist spotted the boy. His small body crumpled on the ground, covered in blood. He pulled over, horrified, and called for help. Sean, barely conscious, managed to speak the words that exposed everything. "My mum did this." Back at the scene, Michelle staged herself as a victim. She tied her own hands and inflicted shallow cuts on her body, telling police that a stranger had ambushed them. But the story fell apart almost immediately. The duct tape had her fingerprints. The knife matched the wounds. And most damning of all, her own son's testimony cut through her lies. The community was stunned. Coralville had never seen anything like it. News outlets across Iowa exploded with the story of the Iowa mom who slaughtered her children. Neighbors who once waved to Michelle outside her home now struggled to comprehend how a woman they thought they knew could commit such horror. The trial in 2009 was one of the most emotional Iowa had ever witnessed. Prosecutors painted Michelle as cold and calculating, a woman who wanted to rid herself of the burdens of motherhood and reinvent herself as a victim of violence. They revealed the preparation, the duct tape, the secluded location, the lies she spun. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a plan. But the trial's most unforgettable moment came when Sean, now 8 years old, took the stand. Thin, pale, with scars still visible on his neck, he faced his mother in court. His small voice carried the weight of the dead. He told the jury how she tied him up, how she stabbed him, how she killed his baby brother. At one point, he raised his hand and pointed directly at her, saying, "She did this." The courtroom fell silent. Even hardened court reporters admitted they fought back tears. Jurors later confessed that Sean's testimony alone was enough to convict her. Michelle's defense tried to argue mental illness. They spoke of depression, psychosis, overwhelming stress, but jurors couldn't ignore the planning, the lies, the sheer brutality of what she did. This wasn't insanity. This was murder. Michelle Kehoe was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Seth, attempted murder for trying to kill Sean, and child endangerment. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Today, she serves her sentence at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women. She has faded into obscurity, remembered only when her case resurfaces in true crime documentaries. But her surviving son, Sean, carries the legacy. He grew up with scars both physical and emotional. He became the boy who testified against his own mother, who turned her lies inside out and forced the world to see the truth. What makes this case so haunting is the betrayal. A mother's instinct is supposed to be protection, to throw herself in front of danger, to keep her children safe at all costs. Michelle did the opposite. She lured her sons into isolation, silenced one forever, and tried to silence the other. But she failed. Her youngest son, Seth, never saw his third birthday. But her oldest, Sean, survived. And in surviving, he destroyed her narrative. He stood in court, his small voice louder than all her lies, and made sure the world knew that his own mother was the monster. Michelle Kehoe thought she could play the victim. Instead, she became one of the most hated mothers in Iowa history, and her surviving son became her ultimate judge. In the quiet town of Schenectady, New York, tragedy seemed to follow one woman like a curse. Neighbors whispered about the bad luck, the heartbreak, the endless funerals. Mary Beth Tinning buried one baby after another, 9 children in total between 1972 and 1985. For years, people believed she was cursed with the cruel hand of fate. But in reality, Mary Beth wasn't a grieving mother at all. She was a killer, one of the most prolific maternal murderers in American history. Mary Beth Rowe was born in 1942, the daughter of an abusive father who often reminded her she had been unwanted. She grew up shy, insecure, and desperate for attention. In 1965, she married Joe Tinning, a quiet man who worked at a nearby factory. They settled into a modest home in Schenectady and started a family. But motherhood for Mary Beth wasn't about love. It became a stage for manipulation, sympathy, and, ultimately, murder. Her first child, Jennifer, was born in 1972. Within just a few days, Jennifer died suddenly at the hospital. Doctors believed it was meningitis, and the tragedy was written off as natural. The community rallied around Mary Beth, showering her with sympathy. A year later, her son Joseph died at just 5 months old. Again, the cause was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, CRED death. Then, just weeks later, her daughter Barbara died the same way. 3 children dead in less than 2 years. Friends and neighbors were horrified. People sent food, prayed for her family, and whispered about the unimaginable misfortune of the Tinnings. But the deaths didn't stop. Over the next decade, child after child died under Mary Beth's care. In 1975, Timothy, just 5 months old, was gone. In 1978, Nathan, just 4 years old, died suddenly after being taken to the hospital. In 1979, Mary Beth adopted a baby boy named Michael. She seemed to want to fill the void left by the deaths of her biological children. But within a year, Michael too was dead. By 1980, suspicions were rising. No family loses 7 children to natural causes. Doctors began quietly discussing the possibility of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or even murder. But without evidence, no one confronted her. In 1981, Mary Beth's daughter Mary Frances died at the age of 4. A year later, her son Jonathan died at just 4 months old. And in 1985, her final child, Tammy Lynn, was born. Within months, Tammy was dead too, suffocated in her crib. 9 children, all dead. Finally, investigators could no longer ignore the pattern. In 1986, police confronted Mary Beth after Tammy's death. During questioning, she confessed, not to all 9 murders, but to smothering 3 of her children, Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn. She admitted she had killed them because they annoyed her and because she didn't want them around anymore. Even her partial confession was enough. In 1987, Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tammy Lynn. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Throughout the trial, Joe Tinning, her husband, stood by her. He claimed he never suspected her, never believed she could be guilty. Even after her conviction, he visited her in prison, insisting she was a good wife who had made mistakes. The loyalty baffled the public. How could a father watch 9 children die and not suspect? Some speculated Joe was in denial. Others believed he simply couldn't face the truth. Psychologists have debated Mary Beth's motives for decades. Some argue she suffered from Munchausen by proxy, a disorder where caregivers harm children to gain sympathy and attention. Others believe she was a narcissist who enjoyed the control that came with life and death. But her own words painted a colder picture. She told investigators she just didn't want the children anymore. Mary Beth's case shook the medical community. It forced doctors to reevaluate how sudden infant deaths are investigated. No longer could multiple deaths in one family be written off as coincidence. Pediatricians across the country began flagging repeated cases of crib death for deeper investigation, largely because of Mary Beth Tinning. In prison, Mary Beth lived quietly. She was denied parole several times because she refused to accept full responsibility. At hearings, she often minimized her actions, insisting she wasn't a monster, just a woman who had made mistakes. But in 2018, after more than 30 years behind bars, Mary Beth was finally granted parole. At the age of 75, she walked free from Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She returned to Schenectady, the same community where she had buried 9 children, living in the shadows of her past. Her release sparked outrage. Many believed she should never have been allowed to breathe free air again. The thought of a woman responsible for so much death, quietly shopping at local stores or walking down neighborhood streets, unsettled everyone who remembered the case. Mary Beth Tinning's story remains one of the most disturbing examples of maternal evil. For more than a decade, she manipulated her neighbors, her doctors, and even her own husband, hiding behind sympathy while burying child after child. To this day, her name triggers anger and disbelief, because Mary Beth Tinning didn't just fail as a mother, she turned motherhood into a weapon, and the children, who should have been her greatest love, became her victims. Some cases are so violent, so heartbreaking, they leave even seasoned detectives shaken. The story of Theresa Riggi is one of those cases. An American mother living in Scotland, Riggi didn't just kill her children, she butchered them in an explosion of rage and despair. It's a crime that stunned 2 countries, one that left neighbors, police, and even hardened reporters speechless at the sheer brutality of a mother's betrayal. Theresa Riggi was born in California in 1965. She grew up in a strict, devoutly religious household, and by her 20s, she had moved to Colorado. There, she married Pasquale Riggi, an oil executive. At first, their marriage looked successful. They had money, stability, and eventually 3 children, twin boys, Austin and Luke, and a daughter, Cecilia. To the outside world, it looked like a picture-perfect family. But behind closed doors, Theresa was unstable. She was controlling, paranoid, and deeply insecure. Friends described her as overbearing, someone who demanded absolute obedience from her children. She insisted they take music lessons, practice endlessly, and live according to her rigid rules. As her marriage began to crumble, Theresa's behavior became more erratic. By 2010, Theresa and Pasquale were locked in a bitter custody battle. Pasquale wanted the children to live with him. Theresa was determined to keep them, no matter the cost. To her, the thought of losing her children wasn't just painful, it was unthinkable. And in her twisted mind, if she couldn't have them, no one could. On August 4th, 2010, police were called to Theresa's Edinburgh townhouse after reports of a gas leak and an explosion. What they found inside was the stuff of nightmares. 8-year-old twins, Austin and Luke, and their 5-year-old sister Cecilia were lying dead in their bedrooms. Each child had been stabbed multiple times, so many times that investigators lost count. The twins had been stabbed at least 8 times each. Cecilia, the youngest, suffered an equally violent end. It was clear from the blood patterns that the children had tried to defend themselves, struggling against their mother's attack. Theresa herself was found badly injured. She had tried to kill herself by jumping from a balcony, but survived with broken bones. Neighbors reported hearing a loud blast from the gas explosion she had triggered before attempting to leap to her death. The scene horrified even veteran detectives. One officer described it as the most harrowing crime scene I have ever witnessed. Reporters at the trial later admitted they had nightmares after covering the case. As details emerged, the public tried to make sense of the senseless. Why would a mother commit such an atrocity? The answer lay in the custody battle. Theresa was convinced she was losing control of her children. In her warped mind, killing them was a way of keeping them with her forever. During her trial, prosecutors laid out the brutality in detail. The children's father, Pasquale, sat in the courtroom, weeping as he listened to the descriptions of his children's final moments. He had been fighting for custody, trying to protect them, only to discover they had been slaughtered by the very person he trusted to love them. Theresa initially pled not guilty, but later changed her plea to diminished responsibility. Psychiatrists testified that she suffered from narcissistic and borderline personality disorders. They said she couldn't cope with rejection, and when her marriage collapsed, she spiraled into destructive rage. In 2011, she was sentenced to 16 years in prison for culpable homicide, Scotland's equivalent of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The sentence outraged many, who believed she should have faced life in prison for the sheer savagery of the murders. Theresa Righi never served her full sentence. In 2014, just 3 years into her term at Court in Vale Women's Prison, she was found dead in her cell. She had killed herself, ending her life just as brutally as she had ended her children's. The Righi case left scars on Scotland. It became one of the most infamous family murders in the nation's history. In the US, it barely made headlines, overshadowed by other domestic crimes. But for those who know the case, the details are unforgettable. 3 innocent children, brutally stabbed, betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect them. What makes Theresa Righi's story so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the motive. This wasn't about money, or revenge, or even delusion in the traditional sense. It was about control. Theresa's children weren't individuals to her. They were possessions. And when she felt those possessions slipping away, she destroyed them, rather than let anyone else have them. Today, Theresa Righi's name is remembered in true crime circles as one of the most shocking maternal murders of the modern era. Not just because of what she did, but because she proved that evil isn't always distant or hidden in strangers. Sometimes it lives right inside the home, behind locked doors, waiting for the moment when control slips away.
Yeah. Well, I didn't really have too many options, you know.
Could have put the child up for adoption. And I don't know if you should mention that other thing either.
Olympic athlete, school teacher, girlfriend, party girl, killer. That was the double life of Kelly Lane, a woman who fooled friends, family, and even the public for years. Her case is one of Australia's most infamous, a tale of hidden pregnancies, missing babies, and a mother who seemed to live two completely different lives at once. Kelly Lane was born in 1975 in Sydney. To anyone who knew her, she looked like she had it all. She was a tall, attractive blonde, athletic and competitive, with dreams of playing water polo at the Olympic level. By the 1990s, she was a rising star in the sport, competing nationally, studying to become a teacher, and moving through Sydney's social scene like she owned it. Outwardly, she was living the perfect young adult life. But behind that polished exterior, Keely carried a secret that would eventually destroy everything. Between 1992 and 1999, Keely Lane became pregnant at least 5 times. Yet, hardly anyone in her close circle knew. Her parents, her boyfriends, even her teammates had no idea. She concealed each pregnancy with careful clothing choices, intense training, and lies about weight fluctuations. And every time she gave birth, she managed to cover her tracks. 2 of the children were adopted out legally. One was raised by her parents under the impression that he was a relative's child. But one baby, a little girl named Tegan, born in 1996, simply vanished. According to hospital records, Kelly gave birth to Tegan on September 12, 1996, at Auburn Hospital in Sydney. 2 days later, she checked out. She was last seen leaving the hospital, carrying the infant. From that moment, Tegan was never seen again. Kelly went on with her life as if nothing had happened. She went to a wedding the same day she left the hospital, smiling and posing for photos as if she hadn't just given birth. She returned to training, to boyfriends, to her usual routine. There were no signs of a newborn, no paperwork, no relatives caring for the baby, no adoption files. It was as if Tegan had vanished into thin air. For years, nobody noticed. Kelly's carefully constructed facade held up. But by the late 1990s, adoption authorities began asking questions about her repeated pregnancies and the missing child. A deeper investigation uncovered the shocking truth. Tegan had disappeared, and no trace of her had ever been found. Police interrogated Kelly for hours. Her stories shifted. At times she claimed she handed the baby to the biological father, a man named Andrew Morris, but Morris denied ever seeing the child. Other times she suggested Tegan had been adopted informally, or that she didn't remember the details. The inconsistencies piled up. Detectives believed there was only one explanation. Kelly Lane had killed her baby shortly after leaving the hospital. The case went to trial in 2010. Prosecutors argued that Kelly murdered Tegan because she saw the child as an obstacle. Motherhood didn't fit the glamorous, high-energy life she wanted. A baby would have ended her Olympic dreams, her relationships, her carefully managed image. To Kelly, killing the baby was easier than facing the truth. The defense countered that no body had ever been found, no forensic evidence tied her to murder, and that the case was built entirely on circumstantial suspicion. They suggested the baby may have been given away, hidden, or raised secretly by someone else. But the jury didn't buy it. After weeks of testimony, they convicted Kelly Lane of murdering her daughter Tegan, even without a body. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 13 years. The trial divided Australia. Some believed Kelly was a cold-blooded killer who disposed of her child to protect her lifestyle. Others argued she was a victim of a justice system that convicted her without physical evidence. To this day, supporters maintain her innocence, insisting that without a body, no one can truly know what happened to Tegan. But the facts remain chilling. 5 pregnancies, multiple hidden births, lies upon lies, and one baby girl who disappeared forever. Kili Lane is eligible for parole in the mid-2020s, but she continues to deny murdering her daughter. In prison interviews, she claims she loved Tegan and that the baby was given to her biological father. Yet Andrew Morris and every other alleged caregiver deny this. The mystery lingers, but the verdict stands. The court ruled her guilty of infanticide. What makes this case so haunting is the contrast. On one side, a woman celebrated as an Olympic-level athlete, representing health, strength, and discipline. On the other, a secretive killer who concealed pregnancies like a double life and whose child simply vanished. In Australia, Kili Lane's name is forever linked with betrayal, not just of her daughter, but of everyone who believed in her. Her teammates, her lovers, her family. She fooled them all, and the one who paid the ultimate price was an innocent baby who never had a chance to grow up. Some mothers neglect their children, some abuse them, but Theresa Knorr took maternal cruelty to a level so depraved that her story has become legend in the darkest corners of true crime. Her reign of terror stretched over a decade, marked by torture, starvation, beatings, and eventually, murder. She didn't just destroy her children's lives, she forced them to participate in the destruction of their siblings. Theresa Knorr is remembered as one of the most sadistic mothers in American history. Theresa Cross was born in 1946 in Sacramento, California. Her childhood was troubled, marked by instability and alleged abuse. She married young, had children quickly, and by her early 30s she was already a mother of 6. But motherhood didn't soften her, it hardened her. Her children, Howard, Sheila, Susan, William, Robert, and Terry, grew up under the rule of a tyrant. Theresa was volatile, paranoid, and obsessed with control. She beat them regularly, often with belts, fists, and wooden planks. Food was withheld as punishment. Schooling was irregular. Neighbors later said they rarely saw the kids outside. Inside that house, Theresa created a private kingdom of fear. But physical abuse was only the beginning. Theresa's cruelty escalated into sadistic psychological torture. She humiliated her children, accused them of sins they hadn't committed, and kept them isolated from the outside world. By the early 1980s, her paranoia was spiraling out of control. She became convinced that her daughters were witches, that they were trying to curse her, seduce men, or bring shame to the family. And then came the murders. Her first victim was her daughter Suzanne. In 1982, after years of abuse, Suzanne begged her mother to let her leave home. Theresa agreed, but only on one condition. Suzanne had to allow Theresa to perform surgery on her. Suzanne had been shot in the stomach months earlier, during one of her mother's fits of rage, and the wound had become infected. Rather than take her to a hospital, Theresa decided to operate herself. What followed was a scene of pure horror. In the living room, with no medical training, Theresa used a pair of scissors to dig into the wound. She had her sons hold Suzanne down while she cut into her flesh. When the girl screamed, Theresa gagged her. Eventually, she declared the surgery a success, but the wound became worse. Suzanne grew weaker, feverish, unable to move. In July 1984, Theresa made her final decision. She and her sons drove Susan, barely alive, to a remote area by Lake Tahoe. There, Theresa forced her boys to douse their sister in gasoline. As Susan lay on the ground, unable to resist, Theresa ordered them to set her on fire. They obeyed. Suzanne burned alive, her screams echoing through the night. She was just 17 years old. But the horror didn't end there. Her next victim was Sheila, her oldest daughter. Theresa accused Sheila of becoming promiscuous, of disgracing the family. She locked her in a closet for weeks, denying her food, water, and even the chance to use a bathroom. The time Theresa unlocked the door, Sheila was dead from starvation and dehydration. Theresa forced her sons once again to dispose of the body. They carried Sheila's to a field and left them to rot. She was only 20. By this point, the remaining children were broken. They lived in constant terror, obeying every command. They knew that disobedience meant death. The reign of terror finally collapsed in 1993. Nearly a decade later, Terry, the youngest daughter, escaped the home and told police what had happened. At first, her story seemed too grotesque to be real, but investigators dug into the missing sisters, and soon, the pieces fell into place. Witnesses confirmed sightings of Theresa's children disappearing. Remains were matched to Sheila. The truth was undeniable. In 1995, Theresa Knorr was arrested in Salt Lake City. Her trial shocked the nation. Prosecutors laid out the details: the shootings, the torture, the closet imprisonment, the forced burnings. Even hardened jurors wept as they heard what Suzanne and Sheila had endured. Theresa showed no remorse. Faced with overwhelming evidence and testimony from her surviving children, Theresa pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Theresa Knorr is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona. She will never walk free. Her story raises the darkest questions about motherhood. How can a mother become a torturer, a murderer, an executioner of her own blood? For Theresa, it wasn't a moment of madness. It was a lifestyle, years of cruelty that escalated until death was inevitable. What makes this case unforgettable is the forced complicity. The surviving children grew up not only as victims, but as unwilling participants in their siblings' murders. They carried the guilt, the shame, and the trauma for decades. Theresa Knorr's legacy is one of terror. Not just a bad mother, not just abusive, but a sadist who turned her home into a chamber of horrors. 2 daughters murdered, 4 other children scarred for life, and the name that stands among the most evil mothers who ever lived.
Happy birthday to you.
What kind of cold individual can stand out there at a gravesite and joke about children who have been killed 8 days earlier?
If you knew Devin and Damon, you would know that they're up in heaven, and they're up there having the biggest birthday party that we could ever imagine.
No grieving mother can do that, in my opinion.
Rowlett, Texas, June 6, 1996. At 2:30 in the morning, a call comes into 911.
You walked in here and did it, Dan. Nothing perfect. Nothing perfect.
On the line is 26-year-old Darlie Routier. Her voice is panicked, frantic, trembling with terror. She screams over and over, "They killed my babies." Officers rush to the Routier home, a 2-story brick house in a quiet Dallas suburb. What they find inside is carnage. 6-year-old Devin lies on the floor, his body riddled with stab wounds, lifeless. Nearby, 5-year-old Damon is gasping for air, bleeding from multiple knife wounds. He dies minutes later, before paramedics can save him. The living room is drenched in blood. The couch, the carpet, the walls, everything is stained red. And there is Darlie. She has cuts on her arms, bruises, and a splash across her throat. She tells officers a chilling story that an intruder broke into her home in the middle of the night, attacked her and her children, then fled through the garage. It should have been a straightforward case of home invasion, but investigators didn't buy it. The Routiers had been considered a picture-perfect family. Darlie was young, blonde, and glamorous, the type of woman neighbors described as a cheerleader mom. Her husband Darren was a computer businessman who had provided the suburban dream: cars in the driveway, a swimming pool in the backyard, 3 healthy children. But the reality was darker. Darren's business was struggling. The couple was under serious financial pressure. Darlie confided to friends that she felt overwhelmed, exhausted, even resentful of the pressures of motherhood. Those feelings became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Police began dissecting the crime scene. The garage window screen had been cut, supposedly the entry point for the intruder, but the dust and cobwebs around it were untouched. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing in the house was stolen. The kitchen knife found in the sink, believed to be the murder weapon, had tiny fiberglass particles on it, the same material used in the cut window screen. Investigators concluded the scene had been staged. Forensics also raised questions about Darlie's wounds. Her throat was slashed, yes, but doctors testified that the cut stopped just millimeters short of her carotid artery. The injuries looked serious, but not fatal. The kind someone could inflict on themselves while still ensuring survival. Then came the most infamous moment of the case, the video. Just 8 days after burying her sons, Darlie was filmed at the cemetery on what would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Surrounded by family, she sang happy birthday, laughed, and sprayed silly string over the grave. To prosecutors, this was damning. They played the footage again and again in court, arguing that it showed her lack of grief, her cold indifference to her children's deaths. The defense countered that the tape was taken out of context. Earlier that same day, they argued, Darlie had been filmed weeping, collapsing in grief at the gravesite. The silly string, they said, was her attempt to honor her son with joy, the way he would have wanted. But the image of a laughing mother at a child's grave stuck in the jurors' minds. The trial began in 1997, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters from across the country descended on Dallas. Prosecutors painted Darlie as a selfish, resentful woman who snapped under pressure. They claimed she killed her boys out of frustration and desperation, then staged the break-in to cover it up. The defense fought back hard. They argued there was no motive. Darlie adored her sons and had no history of abuse. They pointed to her injuries as proof of an intruder. They criticized the police for botching evidence collection, contaminating the crime scene, and focusing too quickly on Darlie instead of looking for other suspects. But the jury sided with the state. In February 1997, Darlie Routier was convicted of capital murder in the death of Damon. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The verdict split the nation. To many, she was a cold-blooded killer, the embodiment of the evil mother archetype. To others, she was a victim of tunnel vision and circumstantial evidence, condemned by a single video clip. Darlie has spent more than 25 years on Texas death row. She continues to maintain her innocence, insisting an intruder was responsible. Over the years, her case has become one of the most debated in true crime. Supporters argue that new DNA testing on evidence could prove her story. Critics point out that no credible intruder has ever been identified. Her appeals have dragged on for decades, keeping her execution on hold. Meanwhile, public fascination with her story has only grown. Documentaries, books, and podcasts revisit the case regularly, reigniting debate. Some call her the most evil mother in America. Others call her one of the most tragic victims of a wrongful conviction. But two facts remain unadeniable. Devon and Damon Routier were brutally murdered in their own home, and their mother, the person they trusted most, remains at the center of the horror. The final image the world remembers is the silly string, a smiling, laughing Darlie standing over her children's graves, spraying colored foam into the air. To some, it's proof of her guilt. To others, it's a mother clinging to a moment of light in unbearable darkness. Whatever you believe, Darlie Routier's story is one of betrayal, blood, and controversy, a case that will continue to divide opinion for as long as it is remembered. And that wraps up our list of the most evil mothers of all time. 10 stories of betrayal and brutality that prove the scariest monsters aren't always strangers. Sometimes, they're the ones meant to protect us. Which case disturbed you the most? And what's your take on Darlie Routier, cold-blooded killer, or innocent mother wrongfully condemned? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more deep dives into the darkest crimes in history. Because, as these cases show, The most dangerous place isn't always outside your door. Sometimes it's right at home.